This session is going to focus on air cargo. We've got a few speakers today. So we have Andrew Matters, our Head of Policy Analysis, who's going to give an overview of the financial performance of the air cargo industry and what we see to be the future. Then we have our Global Head of Cargo, Brendan Sullivan, who's going to give a cargo overview of the key challenges and issues and what's positive for air cargo. Then we'll move on to Dave Brennan, our Head of Cargo for Safety and Dangerous Goods, who's going to focus on lithium batteries and the challenges, the growth in that market and the challenges that's creating and how we're working together to ensure the safe carriage of lithium batteries. We'll then move to Henk Mulder, our Head of Digital Cargo, who'll be discussing and giving everybody an overview of where we are in terms of the digitalization of air cargo and the importance moving forward. And then finally, to Sonia Ben Hamida, Head of Special Cargo, who'll be giving you an overview of everything the industry is doing to move things like your pets, perishables, so all the special precious cargo around the world. So without further ado, Andrew, I'd like to hand over to you.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone. It's terrific to be with you all today. As always, there's plenty happening in air cargo. And the first slide I've got today is one that you will have seen yesterday when Marie presented on the broader industry outlook. In this slide, it makes very clear when we compare back to 2019 levels that the performance of the air cargo recovery has been very different in both in timing and in magnitude to what we've seen on the air passenger side. So you can see, looking at CTKs or cargo volumes at the top of the chart, a much narrower fall, a quicker recovery, and in fact cargo volumes returned above their 2019 levels in January 2021. They've continued for a period above that level, but when we got to the start of this year, you can see there's a bit of a decline coming into play. CTKs dropped back to around their 2019 levels in the early part of this year, and more recent months have actually declined a little bit further. So currently, CTKs are down around 6% compared with their 2019 levels. Now that's all very interesting, and 2019 is certainly a useful point of comparison. But we also need to think about what's been going on in terms of the year-on-year development. And when you saw that decline towards the latter part of the previous chart, that's reflected here. So in this chart, the blue line just shows the level of cargo volumes, the level of CTKs, and they're plotted on the left-hand axis. We've got the year-on-year growth rate in the red line. And you can see by looking at that red line, it's very clear that air cargo volumes are currently declining. And they're declining in the face of global headwinds. Right? And once again, Maria has spoken to you about some of those yesterday. Very quickly, they include things like the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, a global growth slowdown, higher inflation, higher interest rates, higher cost of living. All of those things are exerting a bit of a drag in terms of cargo volumes. The other point to note here is that the spike in growth to almost 50% back in 2020 is simply a growth rate that's not sustainable. Right? So that growth rate was always going to moderate from those high levels. We've seen that, but more recently, the growth rate has not only moderated, it's actually started to decline. This chart's a bit messy, but what we're trying to show here is the year-on-year growth rate across the regions. So we're taking the previous chart, we're splitting out to what's happening at the individual region level. There's a lot going on here, but you can see that the decline that we're seeing in cargo volumes is widespread. Right? It's happening across all regions. That's not surprising when you think about the global headwinds that I've just mentioned that are driving developments. Now, of course, the performance, as usual, varies across regions. And you can see, for example, Latin America is the best performer, or the least worst performer, if you want to put it that way, where volumes are down about 1.5%. Compare that with Europe, where they're down almost 19%. And what's driving Europe, unsurprisingly, is the impact of the conflict that we're seeing in the Ukraine. We can also look at what's going on in terms of the cargo load factor. So we know that volumes are down around 13.5% over the past year. At the same time, capacity, or available cargo tonne kilometres, or ACTKs, are down around 0.6%. So when you put those two together, you can see that the cargo load factor has declined. Once again, you can see that sharp step up in 2020, which was held for a period, right? So that step up really relates to the highly unusual circumstances of the COVID pandemic, which drove that. So once again, that's kind of not normal in a sense, right? That's the abnormal period that we're starting to gradually come out of. And you can see that the load factor has returned back towards more pre-COVID levels. It's currently running at 48.7%, and it's down about 7.5 percentage points compared with a year ago. So if we start to think about what that means for the outlook, the first point to note is that we think the decline in cargo volumes is going to continue into 2023. Once again, this primarily reflects the more challenging global economic backdrop, both in terms of global economic growth, but also in terms of international trade. So we've got a decline of about 8% factored in this year, and that's based primarily on the outcomes that we've had over the first 10 months, and a follow-up decline next year in the order of around 4%. When we think about yields, we're also expecting to see that yields are going to unwind in 2023. So we've actually seen yields increase this year. Right? They're up a little bit over 7% this year. Once again, we don't think that that's sustainable. So we've built in a forecast that has yields coming back by something around 22% next year. 22% sounds like a very big number. It sounds pretty dramatic. But I think you'll agree, when you look at the chart, you can see that it doesn't look too unreasonable at all. The reason for that, of course, is the very strong increases that we've seen in recent years. So we had a 50% increase in yields in 2020. That was followed by a 24% increase in 2021. And as I mentioned, a further 7% this year. So the unwind that we're seeing really follows those three pretty strong years of yield increases. Of course, when we put volumes and yields together, that gives us revenue. So with yields coming off and with volumes also expected to come off, no surprise then to see that cargo revenue is likely to be lower this year. Now, once again, we need to look at the decline in revenue that we're forecasting this year in the context of what's happened in recent years. And once again, you can see that although we're coming down from around $200 billion in the past couple of years down to around $150 billion in 2023, we're still about 50% higher than where we were pre-COVID. Right? So once again, the exceptional period that we've had looks like it's coming to an end. We're starting to come back towards more levels across a number of these variables that we're more accustomed to. And when we look at the cargo share of total revenue, similar kind of story. And I think Marie may have used this chart yesterday as well. What you can see, cargo revenue, which is the red area on this chart, is expected to come off a little bit. The percentages that I've put on there is the cargo share of total revenue. So you can see we peaked at about 40% in 2021. Our forecast for this year is that will ease down towards 28%. And then in 2023, it's going to come off a bit further, a little bit below 20%. There's two reasons for that. First one is the decline that we're seeing in cargo revenue. The second one is that at the same time we've got cargo revenue coming off, we've got passenger revenue increasing. So both of those factors work to reduce the cargo share. What's interesting, once again, and I've put a comparison back to 2019 on this chart, cargo was about 12% of total revenue in that pre-pandemic period. So although we've got a bit of an unwind, we're still considerably higher, right? I want to touch on very quickly just a couple of issues. This first one is to put a bit of context around the words that I've already spoken of global growth and the world trade outlook. I mentioned multiple shocks that have impacted both economic activity and trade, the conflict, energy prices, inflation, interest rates, all of those kinds of factors. You can see the impact on the global GDP forecast, which are the blue bars here. We go from around 6%, that very strong year in 2021, where we bounced back from the pandemic, down to around 3% this year. And we're looking at something around 1.25% next year, around 1.3%. Similar kind of profile is happening in terms of international trade, where we're going to decline from around 10% growth, a little bit below 10% in 2021, down to around 3.5% this year, down to 1% in 2023. So you can see that softening. And in that context, against that backdrop, it shouldn't be too surprising that we're seeing this softening in air cargo volumes that we expect is going to continue through into 2023. If you take a look at some of the leading indicators, they're also telling a similar story. They're all pointing to a softer period ahead for air cargo demand. On this chart, we're showing new export orders against cargo volumes, new export orders in the blue line plotted against the left-hand axis. Those of you that are familiar with our monthly cargo briefing notes will recognise this chart. It appears there quite often. You can see over a long period of time, it's a pretty good relationship. Those new export orders have been declining for some time. They're still declining, and as a leading indicator, that points to softness going ahead. If we also think about things like some of the business confidence surveys or the level of business inventories, they're also pointing to softness. So there's a lot of consistency across these leading indicators at the moment. One final point I want to touch on quickly here is around scheduled freighter deliveries. You can see that they're at a pretty high level. The blue bars are the annual freighter deliveries. If you look at the red line there, that's simply a 2-year rolling average. You can see from the red line that for next year, we're actually at the highest point that we've been since back in 2012 in terms of freighter deliveries. So we're getting a strong inflow of new capacity through freighters, just at the same time that we're seeing the cooling in the air cargo market. So that's not great news for cargo yields. And of course, add on to that, the increase that we're expecting to see that in belly capacity through the recovery in the passenger market. Let me finish with a couple of final thoughts. I guess in overview, we think the air cargo market is cooling after what has been a very strong, a very unusual period for the market. And we expect that this is going to continue into 2023. But it's important to note that it's not all bad news. Right? A lot of it is just coming back from unusually high or unsustainably high levels. So cargo revenues are still going to be about 50% higher than their pre-pandemic level. In terms of the risks around the forecasts, it's very easy to think of the downside risks. And it's the downside risks that we often focus on. I would encourage you to think about the upside risks, particularly on this occasion, because they're not insignificant at the moment. Let me give you an example, drawing upon some of these risks that I've outlined here. If, for example, the conflict in the Ukraine was resolved quickly and amicably, to the extent that such a thing is possible in a conflict situation, what we'd expect to see is that consumer and business confidence would rebound and rebound quite quickly. And if that happens, then we could expect to see a recovery in economic activity, a recovery in consumer spending, a recovery in business investment, and a recovery in international trade. So all of those things would be positive for air cargo going forward. So we're keeping a very close eye on a number of those broad macro factors to see just how they're evolving, because there certainly is upside risk to our volume forecast. Two other quick comments that I'd make. Supply chain disruption. We know that global supply chains have been disrupted for a number of years. That's continuing. To the extent that that's adversely impacting developments in the shipping industry, that could present a source of upside risk for air cargo as well, because we might get some trade that goes from shipping back to air cargo just to for businesses to try to plug some of those gaps in their supply chains. And of course, if we were to get a sudden turnaround in confidence that fed through demand, often what we find is that in that first recovery upswing, that favours air cargo because businesses need to get inventory into their warehouses, stock onto their shelves quickly. And it's only through air cargo rather than shipping that we can do that. Finally, quick comment around whether we've seen a structural shift in e-commerce as a consequence of the pandemic. So has the pandemic fundamentally altered consumer behaviour such that e-commerce has moved to a higher level, a new normal, for want of a better term, which helps to underpin the volumes for air cargo going forward?
Thank you.
Catherine, let me leave it there. If we've got some time.
Yeah, we've got time for questions.
Happy to take some questions.
Yep. Kathy? Yep.
Thank you. Quick question, because the chart was too quickly away for me to write down. I'm sorry. The new freighter capacity coming up, is this factory new freighters, full freighters, or is this also passenger to freighters? Freighter deliveries?
It's just freighters.
Just freighters.
Yeah,
so
doesn't include the conversions.
The conversions, because there's a lot of conversions
Correct.
on the market.
Correct.
So it's I can't follow anymore how many they're going on.
Exactly.
You think a little too many coming up, like you said, bad moment?
I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of extra capacity coming through here, and when you add that to the conversions, you add that to the additional belly freight coming up, a lot of new cargo capacity that's coming into a market which is cooling. That's, other things equal, that's going to put downwards pressure on cargo yields. Yeah.
I'll go to Dina next, please, and then we'll come to
Hi, Dina Kamal from The National. We've seen airlines like Emirates and Qatar Airways invest in new freighter orders recently. Do you think this was a miscalculation on their part of how well sustained the cargo performance is going to be after the pandemic, given that you've said the market is already cooling, or do you think the picture is slightly different in the Middle East?
That's a great question. I think, and without being particularly familiar around the order books of specific carriers, we know that there's always a lag between ordering aircraft and having those aircraft delivered. And I guess what we're seeing here in terms of this pullback in volumes, that's not the long-term outlook that we have in mind. We're focusing here very much on the short-term outlook for cargo. So really just focusing in on 2023. I think the long-term outlook is a very different story, and frankly, I think it's a much more positive story. So for airlines that are putting orders in now, by the time they take delivery of those aircraft, we could well be in that period of upswing where volumes have picked up and we've moved to that higher level. So the timing could be spot on. Who knows how that's going to play out, but I think certainly the long-term outlook is more positive for air cargo than what we're looking at for 2023.
Thanks, Andrew. A question at the back, and then we'll come to Andrew.
Eric Renet, newspaper Le Soir, Belgium. Do you have an idea of the evolution of the middle age, the age of the fleet of the freighters?
Not to hand.
Can we get it?
We can take a look.
Yeah.
We may be able to source that data, but I'm afraid I don't have that in my head at the moment.
And then, here. To the front. Two at the front, yeah, thanks.
Hi, this is Andreas Scholz from Freelance from Hamburg. Andrew, as far as new deliveries are concerned, I think there's a certain new demand for middle-sized or middle-range aircraft, the A321. Take Lufthansa, for instance. They discovered that. They switched from the classic wide bodies, 777 and so on, also now employing these type of aircraft. Could you see a common trend that there's a new demand for this category of freighters?
That's a really interesting question. It's not something that we've looked at, to be honest. We have seen that there are particular airlines shifting the composition of their cargo fleet. Whether that's a broader trend, I honestly don't know. It's something that is worth looking into, I suspect. But at this stage, we haven't broken down the composition of the fleet or of new delivery books to try to understand what that means for the way cargo is going to evolve going forward. It's certainly an interesting question.
Damien?
Damien Brett from Air Cargo News. Given the supply-demand picture looks like it's returning back to kind of pre-COVID levels, is there something else that's supporting the higher yields that you said you're expecting next year? Like why are the prices staying up if the...
Well, we've got a fairly significant decline built in, right, above 20%. So I think that's a substantial decline. Yeah, it is. And I think, depending how the market evolves, particularly some of those macro headwinds that we've spoken about in the last couple of days, there are risks around those yields. They could fall quicker than what we anticipate. We think, the forecast that we've put together is a reasonably balanced forecast, but there are risks around all of the elements there, whether we're talking about the volumes or the yields going forward. So, yeah, absolutely. We're very much aware of that and looking very closely at developments in all of these things, but particularly yields are a critical part of the factor of the forecast. Given that we think there's going to be some softness in volumes as well, so understanding how those things are evolving in our more regular monthly data is important.
Thank you. Thank you. One last question.
R.K. Patra from Strat Times India. And do you have any statistics on aerospace or AOG cargo in the entire chain?
The short answer from economics is no. I haven't seen anything on that. Mind you, I don't think we've looked, to be fair. That's something we haven't considered.
Thank you, Andrew.
Terrific. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Now